Hello, friends. I'm Leif Unar, the faculty director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society, and I'm just delighted to welcome you to the Wesson Lecture for this evening. The Wesson Lectures were endowed by Robert Wesson, a fellow of the Hoover Institution, who hoped that these occasions would help us to reflect together on our roles as citizens in a democracy. For over 20 years, the Wesson Lectures have been amongst the most prestigious occasions at Stanford. Previous lecturers have included the historians Jill Lepore, Eric Foner, Timothy Garden Ash, law professors Cass Sunstein, Lawrence Lessig, Richard Posner, and Timothy Wu, philosophers John Rawls, Elizabeth Anderson, and Amiya Srinivasan, the psychologist Alison Gopnik, and former U.S. Representative Barney Frank. Our topic tonight is the democratic imperative to end homelessness, and our host for tonight is someone with deep engagement and expertise in these issues. Davy Kim of the Ethics Center. Davy has been a volunteer activist in San Francisco for many years on housing. He's done fascinating work with civil society organizations in the city on their views on land use and housing. And you may have seen his writing in the San Francisco Examiner or in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, where he has made the case that the affluent should transition from place-based to person-based giving. Davy, would you like to take the podium?
Thank you, Leif, and to Ann Newman for giving me the chance to impress upon all of you the importance of tonight's discussion. If you work on housing long enough, you will discover a wonderful sense of agency, that even a modest level of local organizing actually goes a long way to make visible and material changes to our cities for the better. But it's not all upside, because working on housing is also like wandering into a confusing jungle ecosystem with layers of nuance on regulations, planning codes, electoral boundaries, public hearing schedules, construction financing, etc. And with it, an array of technical concepts, zoning, impact fees, racially restrictive covenants, single-stair reform, ministerial versus discretionary approval. To add, a host of acronyms, ADU, BMR, PSH, LIHTC, CEQA, HULK, NIMBY, YIMBY, SHIMBY, FIMBY, and the list goes on. Yes, it's jargon, but if you wish to truly understand the question of who gets housing and where, these concepts are actually essential, and our panelists tonight will help us demystify this world. But to ground us in ethics, I'm going to make a provocation, and it is that each of these concepts represents a new layer of abstraction that can obscure our democratic responsibilities to those experiencing housing precarity. What do I mean? Well, to read from the satire site McSweeney's Internet Tendency, a fake op-ed title reads, "Housing should be affordable, except when I sell my house for $1 million." This sets the stage for two sometimes competing diagnoses on housing and homelessness. One asks whether we've allowed the corporate class, developers, private equity, or tech companies to run roughshod over our communities and to drive up prices. The other asks, as implied by the headline, is how much of the problem is us? Us meaning everyday citizens who may act in seemingly innocuous ways, voting to preserve single-family zoning, voting to increase the exclusivity of their own school districts, or to demand years of community hearings just to build permanent supportive housing. Democracy working as intended? Maybe. After all, it is community determination. But what of the nannies, baristas, janitors who commute 2+ hours a day to serve said community? What of its unsheltered population? What of anyone who doesn't possess a local address? What is their democratic say? We all support, even demand, housing for the most vulnerable, but thanks to this jungle of abstraction, these things in turn only seem to end up being supported in the abstract. So what's the way forward? Well, I don't want to discourage technical or wonky conversation tonight, but it was highly intentional for us to bring in distinguished speakers with an added expertise on inequality, on dimensions of homelessness, racial identity, renter status, et cetera, to help us incorporate these tough questions and dynamics on ethics and democracy. Our format tonight, 3 presentations from our panelists, our discussant to moderate, and thereafter Q&A. We will have microphones. Please have questions ready, and please keep them brief. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Up first is Michael Lenz, Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy, Chair of the Luskin Undergraduate Programs, and Associate Faculty Director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA. I'm a fan of the podcast. Lenz's research and teaching explores the potential of public policy to address housing market inequities that lead to negative outcomes for low-income families and communities of color. His research has won awards from the Journal of American Planning Association and Housing Policy Debate. He's also released a book, Where the Hood At? 50 Years of Change in Black Neighborhoods. After that will be Margot Kushel, a professor of medicine at UCSF and division chief of the Division of Health and Society. She's director of the UCSF Action Research Center for Health and the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative. A practicing general internist at SF General Hospital, her research focuses on the causes and consequences of homelessness with the goal of preventing and ending homelessness and ameliorating its effect on health. She's also PI of the California State Study of People Experiencing Homelessness and numerous NIA-funded studies on older adult homelessness. Third up is Carolina Reed, who is I. Donald Turner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy at UC Berkeley, and Faculty Research Advisor for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Her current research focuses on improving outcomes in permanent supportive housing, reforming the affordable housing finance system, and understanding the drivers of housing insecurity and residential development. You can find coverage of her work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. Finally, moderating our discussion tonight is Stanford's own Michelle Wild Anderson, who is Larry Kramer Professor of Law and Professor of Environmental Social Sciences at the Doers School of Sustainability. She writes and teaches in the areas of poverty and inequality, local government law, housing, and environmental justice. Her recent book, Fight to Save the Town, Reimagining Discarded America, focuses on the dismantling and rebuilding of local government in high poverty communities. She's also chair of the board of directors of the National Housing Law Project and a board member of the East Bay Community Law Center in Oakland. So with that, let me welcome our first presenter, Michael Lenz.
All right, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you so much for the invitation, specifically from Anne and from the McCoy Center for putting this together. And it's always great to share time and space in this panel coming up with Carolina and Margot. And I feel like I have a tough act to follow after after Davey's rundown there. But I'm very happy that you illuminated for us, I think, some of the challenges that we have kind of trying to understand the housing environment, the housing policy environment, and hopefully I can provide one lane of understanding or help you to understand at least one piece of this complicated puzzle. So this is a complicated policy area, and in California, one that has many problems. And so one way that I would identify and summarize this problem is just that the cost of housing is extremely high in California. That's fairly obvious. Some ways that you can kind of grok that is that California literally has some of the most expensive cities to buy a home on the planet. That is just a very easy kind of number to understand, or set of numbers to understand when you look at them. But like what we're talking about tonight really is about homelessness specifically, and we have a very high overrepresentation of homelessness in the state of California amongst the country's homelessness population, right? 1 in 4 homeless Americans lives in the state of California, which far exceeds our population total of 1 in 12. So that's a big problem, and something that we're not, yet we haven't yet gotten a handle of. And I put this book here, by Greg Colburn and Clayton Aldern. Housing is a homelessness problem, or homelessness is a housing problem. Sorry, and a lot of people and a lot of ways that we've looked at homelessness over the years hasn't really kind of centered the housing part of homelessness. And they do a really, really important task, I think, in looking at how housing markets and failures in housing markets and challenges in housing policy really produce these homelessness outcomes that are front and center here in California, where places with low vacancy rates, high expense, tight challenges building housing are the places where you tend to see high numbers of homelessness. When we talk about how we kind of use some policy levers to make housing more affordable, I always tend to put these policy levers in 3 different buckets. One, we can subsidize people, right? We're always going to have a population of people that find housing unaffordable at virtually any price. And we need to, and I think, many people think that we should provide some money for those people to help afford that housing, right? And so there's a long-standing federal government role in housing subsidy provision. We provide money through various mechanisms to make housing more affordable, right? California itself is, I want to talk about some of the great things that we're doing in this state, and I want to bring some optimism to this story. And one thing I would highlight is that California itself is spending a lot of money on subsidizing people that are experiencing homelessness or experiencing housing challenges in many other ways. We've spent billions of dollars on affordable housing and services for people experiencing homelessness. So these are big dollar amounts that we are contributing and providing for people. I'll kind of zoom through rent control, but one way to kind of make something more affordable or to stop it from getting more expensive is that you stop you produce a government fiat that says you can't raise prices in some form or fashion. And California has a growing number of jurisdictions that are slowing the growth of rent through these policy mechanisms. And the state of California has passed a law in 2019 that caps really large rent increases too. So rent control is part of our policy mix. The thing that I'll talk the most about is production, housing production, how we increase housing supply, why that's important. And specifically, Davey queued this up for me, I will talk about zoning and try not to get too technical about it, but at least bring this onto the table and into our understanding. So all cities use zoning to separate land uses, right? And really what I'm talking about most is about residential zoning, how we determine, what kind of home can be built where. And within residential zones, the most restrictive zoning that we usually talk about is single-family zoning, right? Where you can only have a single-family home on a parcel of land. And we tend to govern several other housing characteristics through zoning. We can govern the size, we can govern the shape, et cetera. All these things that we tend to do when we layer on more and more zoning restrictions is that we are more likely to suppress the housing supply that would naturally occur or occur through market means. But importantly, we also limit the amount of housing that we can produce, or the amount of places where we can produce housing that's subsidized, right? So if we don't allow multifamily housing over large, plots of land in our cities, we're not only, disallowing the market for producing, market rate housing, but we are often disallowing developers from producing housing with subsidies that is affordable and income restricted. So because I put the word zoning up there, I went long and I started talking about this slide too, about why it matters. but I'll make sure that I cover what I didn't cover. I think the important thing for me to note on this slide is you shouldn't believe anybody if they tell you that, like, zoning and creating housing supply through relaxing zoning restrictions is all you need to do to solve the homelessness crisis, to make housing more affordable. But it is a necessary, albeit insufficient, condition. I think the way that these high housing costs, the way that supply connects to high housing costs, right, is it makes housing more scarce. It makes housing larger, if you talk about single-family homes versus multifamily homes. And all of these increases in price add up and become, challenges for people at lower levels of income, all the way down to people who are really precariously housed and experiencing homelessness. And then, I don't want to open the entire can of worms of planning and zoning, but it's not just zoning things. There's a lot of different ways that local jurisdictions like to slow down the production of housing. And there's some, pretty decent research that shows things like planning processes that add fees and other kind of obligations onto people who develop housing add up to make housing more expensive. If you compare, units that are created in Texas to those that are created in California, these units add up to something like, these costs add up to something like $30,000 a unit, and much longer housing production processes. There's a lot of research that tells us that zoning's origins were quite discriminatory. The way this works is that the majority of people who live in single-family housing are racial minorities, have lower incomes on average, and so when you discriminate against a particular type of home, you're also discriminating against particular types of people, and this has been intentionally used to price out racial minorities and low-income people in jurisdictions across the country for many, many decades. How this works in California is that California bans apartments on most residential land. In LA, this looks like 78% of its residential land is zoned single-family only. In the Bay Area, something like 85% of the 101 cities in this region, or 85% of the land is zoned for single-family only in this region. 82% of the residential land in the state is only zoned for single-family. Single-family housing makes tons of sense in a lot of places. In places where there's very, very high demand, say you had a major university and one of the most productive economies in the world, you might want a city allowed for more housing than in some other cities, right? And so where demand is very high, you need some supply. There's a lot of different estimates of how much our housing shortage, how many units we are short across the state. These are estimates taken at different times by different people, giving us different numbers. But most of these estimates are in the millions. And you might think that California's population growth has been fairly robust in recent years, and it's certainly seeming to taper off, but it's grown considerably over recent years. But we would have grown a lot more if we had probably if we had built more housing. We all know people who have looked to move to California, have looked to stay in California, have felt priced out, and have felt that there are not enough vacant units for them to try to find. And so I think there is a very, very real problem with our housing shortage. We talked about acronyms. I'll also give a list of bills that are hard to keep up with. But I also want to kind of highlight this in an optimistic sense. So the state has been trying to take a lot of control for land use away from local governments that have not done a very good job with the responsibility, in my view. And I think there are some interesting democracy questions to talk about through this, right? Like, what is the correct level of government to do this at? Who deserves control over land use? However we land on this, it is a fact that the state has done a lot of work to try to provide parameters over that mandate a reduction in these controls that get in the way of housing. So the hottest topic and the thing people are talking the most about these days is something called SB 79, which essentially upzones near major transit stops. But there's a whole host of other attempts that the state has made. If you go all the way down to the bottom, we've talked a fair amount about single-family zoning already. We are nearing the end of single-family zoning in this state. You can build accessory dwelling units, ADUs, as Davey gave us the acronym on most, or if not virtually all, single-family plots. We also have the ability to split our lots into duplexes and things like that. So there's been a lot of work on this already, and I want to emphasize that. But the bad news is that overall housing production is still low in California. And when we look at the last couple 3 or 4 years post a lot of this housing reform work, we haven't seen the increases in the data just yet. So with that, I'm certainly at time. Thank you for not pulling me off the stage just yet. Thank you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Very short. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here, and it's a pleasure always to work with Carolina and Mike. I'm going to talk a little bit of homelessness and health is what I was asked to talk about. Or the question is like, what is a doctor doing in this room having this discussion? But I would say that health and its intersection with homelessness gives rise to some of the biggest misconceptions about how homelessness starts and what we need to do to end it. So the first thing that I think it's important is to have a little bit of a mental model of what's going on with homelessness and health. So Greg Colburn and Clayton Alderton's fantastic book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, hugely recommend that you read it. You can read it in an afternoon, but if you don't have time to read it, you've got to love a book where the thesis is in the title, really shows quite convincingly that what determines a difference in homelessness rates between communities is the mismatch between housing for the lowest income, the affordability of housing and the availability of it for the lowest income households. But what they talk about also is a precipitance of homelessness, that within any community, the people most at risk for homelessness are those with individual vulnerabilities, which interfere with social functioning, economic functioning, or as I like to think about it, in the Hunger Games for housing in a place like the Bay Area, it makes sense that if you have a disabling condition that interferes with your ability to hold down 2 jobs, to live tripled up with your family in tight quarters, you are going to be the people who most likely lose out. So certainly physical and behavioral health problems can lead to homelessness. But the other part of that story is how homelessness itself is so devastating to health. And the place that's sort of in the middle of all of these is trauma, that people who've experienced trauma throughout their lives, early life trauma, late life trauma, are much more likely to have physical and behavioral health problems. That sets you up for homelessness, and homelessness itself is a deeply traumatic experience. So anywhere you start on this circle, in any direction you go, you would be right. Now, this is their idea of the drivers versus the precipitants. Again, drivers being the lack of affordable housing and income inequality, and the precipitants that we pay most attention to are substance use and mental health problems. And when they called me up, when Greg called me up when he was writing the book, I used this analogy of the game of musical chairs, and Greg later told me that just about everyone he called used the analogy. And I think it's one of the best ways to understand this because it makes it really concrete. Anyone here ever been to a kid's birthday party where you played musical chairs? 10 kids, 10 chairs, the adult plays the music, the kids walk around the chairs, the adult pulls away a chair, and the kids scramble for the remaining chairs as the music stops. So if you were, imagine a birthday party where little Johnny shows up, he's sprained his ankle the night before, he's on his sister's crutches, he doesn't really know how to use them, and if you were bored parents sitting there placing wagers on who was most likely to be standing when you pulled the chair, you'd be right if you said it was most likely to be Johnny. But what if you asked a different question? What if you said not who is standing, but what if you said why is a kid standing? Well, you have 9 chairs and 10 kids, so either 2 kids are sitting on top of each other or somebody's standing. That is how homelessness works. The reason we have so much homelessness is not that we have so many kids who sprain their ankles on crutches or people with disabling conditions, but it's because we don't have enough chairs. And if you were to push that metaphor further and say, well, what if Johnny still showed up with his sprained ankles, but you didn't pull away a chair? It would take him longer to get there, but he would eventually sit down. The problem is that we simply don't have enough chairs. Once you become homeless, though, homelessness is a full body experience. It really occupies every part of someone's life. And as one of our participants in our California statewide study said, most of the time we're running around trying to figure out where we're going to sleep at night. We're not worried about going to the doctors or going to see somebody or going to get help with our mental state. Once people become homeless, it takes up every ounce of their energy and it displaces every ability to look for a job, to go to the doctors, to take care of your ever-worsening physical or behavioral health state. So how bad are people's health? Really bad. If we look, for instance, at our statewide study, this is of adults in California, 45% of them reported fair or poor health. Now, as a doctor, that has a huge meaning to me, and it may have less meaning to you. But if I had one question to ask whether people were likely to wind up in the hospital or die in the next year, this is what I would ask, and this is over 3 times higher than we would expect. Even though people had terrible access to health care, so didn't know that they had diabetes or high blood pressure or a cancer brewing, which you only know if you show up at the doctor, 60% knew that they had a serious health condition. And over a third reported what we call a difficulty with an activity of daily living, difficulty buttoning their clothes or standing up from a toilet seat. This is an aging population. The median age of all of the adults experiencing homelessness in our state is 47. Everyone in our study had to be 18, and the oldest person we spoke to was 89. If you take away the moms living with small children and the very young adults who are sort of considered a separate population, almost half, or 48%, were 50 or older. And of those who were 50 or older, 41% had never been homeless, not even for one night, before the age of 50. And this uncannily matched exactly the same numbers that we had gotten from a similar study that we've been working on in Oakland for many years. Now, how about substance use? That is probably on your mind, and if you have an image of someone who's experiencing homelessness, that's probably what you think of, and you're not totally wrong. In fact, over a third, or 37%, of our participants reported using one of the major categories of illicit drugs, either methamphetamines, non-prescribed opioids, or cocaine, at least 3 times a week during this episode. And the story in California is almost entirely methamphetamines. A third used methamphetamines. 10% were regular users of non-prescribed opioids, but 90% of them were also using methamphetamines. Now, this holds true with every bit of homelessness research across the country and across time, is that stimulants are the main drugs, and this is important for 2 reasons. One is, it is the substance that we have the least good treatment for. We actually have pretty good treatments for opioids, very good treatments for alcohol, and really lousy treatments for stimulants. But the other reason, and not to get all like Walter White on you or anything, but if I had to design the perfect drug to survive unsheltered homelessness, I would come up with methamphetamines. They're cheap. They keep you awake, so if you're looking for predators or if you're trying to recycle to gain money, and they keep you not hungry, and our neighbors are out there starving and scared. I started, I guess you could say, using, when I became homeless, meth. I would use it to stay awake at night, so it's not like I would need a fix in the daytime or anything else. We found that a large proportion of people only started to use regularly after they became homeless. And we're having lots of conversations in our body politic about forcing people into treatment. As someone who spent my 20s and 30s not having a lot of fun, but staying up all night to become a physician so that I could provide substance use treatment, trust me when I say this, it works much better when people are ready for it. Our outcomes are incredibly much better. But only 10% of people experiencing homelessness who met criteria for substance use treatment were receiving any, and mostly low-value types. And 21% told us that they were seeking treatment, but were unable to find it. We're having all of these conversations about forcing treatment, but we're making it hard for those who are most likely to benefit. Mental health symptoms were very common, but driven by depression and anxiety. About 12% of people were reporting current hallucinations. 27% of people had reported having a psychiatric hospitalization, but nearly half of that started after they became homeless. And if you took it all together, about a half of those currently experiencing homelessness had a significant behavioral health problem, illicit drug use, heavy episodic alcohol use, hallucinations, or a recent psychiatric hospitalization, suggesting that they need more help other than just housing to leave homelessness. The experience was harrowing. Over a third reported physical violence during this episode, and 10% reported having been sexually assaulted. In the prior 6 months, lots of people using lots of acute health care. 25% had been admitted overnight for a physical health hospitalization. And we know that the mortality rates of people experiencing homelessness are 3.5 times what we would expect. So what do we do? And I know I have almost no time, so I just want to create a mental map to put a pin in before our discussion. I think that clearly the primary response to homelessness is to increase the availability and affordability of housing for the lowest income households. But what I want us to think about are these 3 different things we need to do. One is to prevent, and prevention is sexy, important, and hard to do, not because we don't know what to do, but because it's a little hard to figure out who to get it to and to get it to them quickly. Most of what we spend our time doing is mitigating the impacts of homelessness. Shelter or interim housing, as it's been noticed, is an effort to mitigate the negative effects of homelessness. We need to do that, but that isn't ending it. And finally, we need to put almost all of our effort into improving exits to help people get out of homelessness. And with that, I will turn it over to Carolina.
All right, glasses. Mike, I'm a little bit taller. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming today, and thank you for inviting me. I always love being on a panel with Margot and Mike, and it's really fun to be able to talk about homelessness in the context of democracy and think about it in a slightly different way. First, just plus 100 to everything that Mike and Margot said. You just learned master class about both the housing underlying reasons why we have such a homelessness problem here in California. And then I think Margot's talk really brings us away from the abstract idea of housing and zoning and laws to the fact that homelessness is a very deeply experienced, embodied state that has direct relevance to both health and mortality. And in my remarks today, I'm going to try and take our conversation up just one level and connect Mike and Margot's insights into broader themes about our approach to addressing homelessness in the United States. So I'm going to make an argument over the course of the next few minutes that contemporary homelessness policy is shaped by two dominant logics, the first of which is scarcity and the second is criminalization. And I think that both of these approaches shape the politics of homelessness in ways that reinforce zero-sum thinking about who deserves help and what is worth investing in. And finally, I'm going to make the case that when we talk about homelessness as a complex or pernicious or difficult problem to solve, I think it's rarely because we don't know what to do. I think we actually have a lot of evidence for what works. The challenge is that we haven't invested in what is needed to deliver those solutions at the scale the problem requires. So let me start with scarcity. Mike already showed us how deeply housing scarcity is embedded in California's political economy. Things like exclusionary zoning, local veto power, decades of underbuilding, and how it underlies homelessness. But scarcity also shapes the architecture of our housing and homelessness assistance programs. So in the United States, only 1 in 5 families who is eligible for housing assistance actually gets that. 1 in 5. Let's contrast that with the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is an entitlement. Everybody who owns their home and pays interest can claim the mortgage interest tax deduction. As a country, we spend way more on housing for people who earn more than $200,000 than we do for households that earn less than $50,000. In the Bay Area, wait lists for housing choice vouchers, which is evidence the single best way of preventing homelessness, particularly among families with children. Most of the waiting lists for housing choice vouchers are closed. And when families are lucky enough to get onto that waiting list, it can be 5, 6, 7, 9, 13 years before they actually get a housing choice voucher. Because of this scarcity, systems need to ration care. We need to develop ways to decide who gets care and who doesn't. And that means that our homelessness and housing response systems are characterized by wait lists, eligibility screens, complex documentation requirements, all of which are designed to restrict access to help rather than provide it. It also makes our systems work less well, and I'm going to give you an example. There is a building in Sacramento, an affordable housing building that includes units of permanent supportive housing, so housing for people who have experienced homelessness, chronic homelessness, and generally have a mental or physical disability. That property, 120 or so units, has units with 8 different definitions of homelessness embedded within it. And every one of those units needs to be filled by somebody who meets that definition of homelessness exactly. So what does this mean? Half the units are empty because trying to get the right person to the right unit because we've created this incredibly complex system of eligibility isn't possible. I also think that scarcity underlies the second approach to homelessness policy in this country, which is criminalization. Because we don't have enough housing and supportive services, cities are confronting a true crisis of unhoused people on city streets. That creates a public safety problem, it creates an economic development problem, it creates a true human problem. So what have they done? They have started to address this visible homelessness through criminalization, including encampment sweeps and anti-camping ordinances. A couple years ago, the Supreme Court passed Grant's Pass decision, which basically affirmed that cities can punish people for sleeping outside even when shelter is unavailable. And what I found particularly striking in reading the reasoning for the majority decision was that encampment sweeps aren't cruel and unusual because we use them all the time. Like, think about that tautological, whatever, anti-democratic principle. And as you can see in the chart there, since Grants Pass was decided, we have seen a notable increase in encampment sweeps and other policing of people experiencing homelessness. This graph is data for Los Angeles. So together, scarcity and criminalization reinforce a politics organized around deservingness and rationing. Because systems are under-resourced, what we are seeing across the United States is that cities and communities are being pushed into false trade-offs. For example, we are seeing significant efforts to narrow who is eligible for housing assistance, for SNAP benefits, for health care. The Trump administration is literally decimating the systems that we use to support people who are lower income. He is also directly targeting immigrant households that receive housing assistance, even asking public housing authorities to provide the names of their residents who then they can give to ICE for, what's it called? Deportation, thank you. We also see cities like San Jose diverting funds from permanent housing for emergency and interim shelters. There's absolutely no doubt that we need more shelter beds, or shelter rooms, or shelter spaces. We need more short-term options to get people housed, or at least in shelter, so that they don't experience all the traumas that Margot talked about in terms of living on the street. But building more interim shelter shouldn't come at the expense of actually investing in durable solutions to ending homelessness. We're also seeing, and Margot mentioned this, a significant backlash against Housing First, which is a true evidence-based intervention to reduce chronic homelessness. It basically says that we should give people housing, and then we should offer treatments and allow them to be ready to accept those treatments and chart their own path to thriving and success. But it is now being pitted against a top-down mandatory approach to treatment that takes away the autonomy of the individual. Again, I'm not arguing that we don't need sober living options. I've done a lot of interviews with people experiencing homelessness, and many of them say they would like to live in a sober living environment. They are ready to address their substance use issues, and they would like to be with other people who are on the same journey. But we shouldn't try a one-size-fits-all. We need to meet people where they are and provide person-centered care. All right. This is where I want to end on a more hopeful note. Because despite both these real challenges of scarcity and criminalization, we actually know a great deal about what works. And I'm going to highlight 3 areas where I think California has made major strides, and what I'd love to come back to in the solutions part of the conversation. First, California has been leading the country in trying to integrate housing and healthcare systems. It still has a long way to go. There's lots of really strong headwinds, but I was recently in Fresno where I was with a housing organization that is using Medicaid dollars to provide significant services to people who are unhoused in the Central Valley, where historically there has been very little resources for homelessness prevention or even homelessness housing. They are using those resources in really innovative ways, including a landlord engagement fund to encourage more private sector landlords to rent to people who are experiencing homelessness. They have managed to place over 2,000 people in those units, and you know how many claims the landlords have had of bad behavior or damage to the property? 1. The efforts to really integrate our housing and health systems are really where we need to go as a state and as a country. Second, the state has invested significantly in building supportive housing over the last 10 years. And I think there's a false narrative that when we build affordable housing, it's too expensive. It is a little bit too expensive. We need to find ways to bring down the cost. Mike talked about impact fees. We shouldn't be asking affordable housing to spend $35,000 a unit on impact fees. But when we are investing in affordable housing, we are investing in a public good for 55 years. And in fact, when we look at that time frame, it is much cheaper to provide permanent housing than it is to provide shelter. And finally, I'm just going to do a shout out. California has an incredible bench of very strong nonprofits that are trying and innovating to address the needs of this population in very person-centered ways. And maybe I can talk about that a little bit more during the solutions part of the panel. So I think there's a lot to build on if we're willing to demonstrate the political will. And I'm going to close with a vignette. I have been interviewing people in permanent supportive housing for the last 3 years. And at one of the properties, I had the opportunity to talk to an African American, a veteran who had served this country in the Army and who had spent 15 years unhoused. He received a permanent supportive housing unit in a property that included both PSH units for veterans, but also just traditional affordable housing for low-income Chinese seniors. And in talking to him, a couple things stood out. First, he said that his new unit gave him roots so he could bloom. He received back custody of his daughter, who he had not had custody of for 10 years. And the year that I interviewed him, she enrolled in UC Berkeley as a freshman. And the very best friend of his in this affordable housing development was an elderly Chinese lady who did not speak a word of English. And you should have seen the two of them hugging each other. And when I asked them what they wanted most at this affordable housing property, they said it was a ping pong table, because they could play ping pong together and build community across these two very divergent populations. And he said, and then we all win. And so I just want to encourage us to see the humanness of this problem, and that when we actually invest in solutions, people can really thrive. And I'll stop there. Should we go sit down?
Thank you all so much for your presentations. And thanks to everybody for being here. It says something about your values that you took time to be here. And for those watching it later on the recording, thank you. We're going to do a quick single pass of some follow-up questions that are sort of targeted to each of our speakers. We'll do a couple of rounds of those, but keep it short, because really I want us to dig into the democracy questions that Leif and Davey built this panel around. It's harder terrain for all of us because typically homelessness and housing are not sort of woven in with these democracy matters. So we're going to save at least half of our discussion time for that. But I can't resist, given their expertise, doing a quick follow-up pass on some of these important questions. So Carolina, can I just start with you? Because as folks know in this room, the Turner Center does incredible research in this field. And they've done such important work over the years on the who and the how of homelessness. And in particular, their research has emphasized the very diverse needs of some really important populations, including families, children, and youth who are living apart from their families, elderly people, and veterans. And I just wanted to invite you to share one of the lessons that you've learned about families and veterans, because those are the populations that have received the most targeted interventions in a public policy sense.
Yeah. So first, veterans homelessness is one of our true success stories. We are almost at functional zero when it comes to homelessness with veterans. Why? One, we've created funds that actually allow us to build units for veterans who are experiencing homelessness. And second, we have a federal VASH program, which provides veterans with a housing voucher and deep case management services. So it is coupling the housing with the affordability with the services. And there's still some things to fix. It's not working perfectly. Certainly, we are seeing headwinds with the current administration. But we can learn a lot from this program because it really does bundle these different solutions together. When it comes to family homelessness, one of the things that has really emerged over the last 8 years is an intervention called rapid rehousing. And this goes to the idea that when people become unhoused, they experience significant trauma, as Margot said, and it is better to rapidly rehouse them than to let them go and become unhoused and experience that trauma. We are learning a lot about these programs. They work great for some families. For some families that have become unhoused due to an economic shock, having 6 months or a year of a temporary rental payment is enough for them to get back onto their feet and actually prevent the homelessness spell entirely. In the Bay Area, for some, it is just not enough to give people a year's worth of rental subsidy because these are people who have very little labor market power and they are never going to earn enough to actually be able to pay rent without a subsidy. And so to Margot's point, I think the next generation of rapid rehousing is really understanding how to target that well to the households who would benefit the most and then really provide housing vouchers for the other families.
Yeah, thank you. Margot, I wanted to invite you to say something more about chronic homelessness, which folks in the audience may appreciate is about a third of the homelessness population, and it is defined as 12 months continuously or 12 months non-continuously out of the last 3 years. And as your presentation captures, there are devastating rates of vulnerability and hardship within this group, including physical disability, trauma, mental health challenges, and substance use. And you also just captured so importantly this vicious cycle of causation in which homelessness is actually driving these vulnerabilities. So I want to invite you to just say something more about some of the commonly held misperceptions or myths about that group, since so much of our public debate, including a recent housing debate among our gubernatorial candidates in California that Carolina and I watched together, these misconceptions are very widely held, even at the top of our political system.
Yeah, they're super widely held. So I think a few things. One is that when I started doing this work 25, 30 years ago, to be chronically homeless, to meet those time thresholds meant that you had likely a disabling condition like a substance use disorder or mental health disability. Now it mostly just means you're homeless. Like if you lose your housing in California, the chance of getting back into housing within a year is very, very low just because our housing costs are so high. But I think when I hear politicians or elected or the public or in the media talking about it, I think what they're talking about is that guy you see on the median whose like hair is matted and who's acting crazy, or the person who is injecting themselves in public or whatever. And I think the single biggest myth is, I'm going to do two. One is that who that person is at that moment is who they have always been and who they will always be. And that is just not the human story. One of the things I love about being a primary care physician is that I have followed people now for 30 years and I have seen ups and downs, and that is true for your families, your loved ones, for you, and it is true for the person you see out there. Who they are in that moment on Fox News is not their whole story. They have they were born from someone, they might have given birth to someone, they have dreams and hopes, and they are not fixed in that moment, and they are very changeable. But the next biggest myth is that they don't want to be housed, that they want to be there. And you see that in that New York Times thing, sort of headline about the policy in San Jose, which was so striking, because the headline says they will be arrested if they refuse housing. The policy is even worse, is that they will be arrested if they refuse shelter. There's lots of reasons people don't want to go into a 400-room unit with like that you have to check in every night and you can't bring your partner with you. Putting that aside, there may be someone who doesn't want to be housed. I have yet to find them. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to tell you about a study that we did right here in Santa Clara County a number of years ago when Santa Clara started to build permanent supportive housing. They basically asked us to use big data to identify their 425 most chaotic homeless people. These were the folks who were in and out of jail, in and out of the hospital, in and out of the psych emergency room. You could have asked any nurse in the psyche or any police officer, they knew these folks, really the most chaotic folks. We decided we didn't have to go and find them, that they were in, the system more than once a week. We would just put a tag in their file and basically call us. And so we only had enough housing units for half of them. We decided we would randomly select them, and this is how it went. If you were one of those people and the police officer picked you up, if you show up in the psych emergency room, there was a big flag that basically said, call Margot, and we would go, someone from the team would go out we worked between like 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. So how it really meant is that we showed up at 7 a.m. after someone had been in jail all night. These are the most chaotic people. And we said, if you're willing, you've never met us before, but if you're willing to sign these 20 electronic pieces of paper that will let our team surveil you for the next 7 years, you get a 50-50 chance of being housed. Who would do that? We had one person say they were too tired. No, 2 people say they were too tired to come back later. 1 person went through the whole process and said no, and 423 people said yes. And we flipped the coin, and as soon as it got flipped to be counted as in the in-group, they were on the hook. Basically, 91% were housed. It took a median of 2 months from this time we met them at the jailhouse doors or in the psychiatric emergency room until they moved into housing. We followed them for 7 years, and on average, once they moved into housing, they stayed for an average of 90% of nights. These were the most complicated, complex, chaotic, troublesome folks, and it worked. What happened? They did more outpatient mental health, more engagement in substance use treatment, their use of the psychiatric emergency room went down, all sorts of other good things. Wasn't perfect, but I don't think anyone doesn't really want housing.
Right.
Amazing. Mike, I wanted to come back to the supply side part of our housing debate.
Yep.
And as you captured so well, so much of that debate focuses on zoning and permitting reform.
Yeah.
And that has, it primarily focuses on the production of multifamily housing, which serves all kinds of inequality problems and is important to our housing supply system way beyond homelessness. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to homelessness itself, it seems to me that there's a rising call for other housing types beyond multifamily.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to invite you to say something about the supply side of these housing debates that is specialized to homeless. And in particular, I'm seeing much more focus these days on settings that do not have shared walls, including mobile home parks, tiny home villages, and so forth. And then secondly, dwellings with shared basic amenities, kitchen, laundry, and so forth in a sort of motel-style dwelling arrangement. So do you think we need a kind of multifamily supply-side conversation and then these other types too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question and a great direction to point us in, a great direction for policy to point in. I think if any policy area needs kind of a yes to all sort of strategy, it's housing. It's our housing problem, not just in this state, but in a growing number of cities across the country. We need housing, of all types for the variety of circumstances that that we have needs for. And so, yeah, I think yes to everything sort of strategy is really, really important. And you highlighted mobile home parks. That's a very underappreciated area of what I guess we would call naturally occurring affordable housing, right? That is typically not subsidized. It's typically not provided with any sort of kind of government intervention. This is housing that is kind of cheaper than most for a number of reasons. But that industry, that housing stock has been not just neglected physically, but has undergone a lot of, I think, financial transformations, legal transformations over the years, where there's more and more precarity for people. So that's just one example of like of a housing stock that I think we really need to preserve. That's not being preserved at the rate that we would like to see. But I think there are so many different housing typologies that we see in other countries that we don't really allow or utilize in this country, that should be part of a multifaceted solution. And I think just thinking more about preservation generally, like we have again naturally occurring affordable housing that exists as housing stock that we need to protect, enhance, rehabilitate, and that's the cheapest way to keep people housed, is to make sure that we have existing structures that stay affordable for them, right? And so we really need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I mean, you said this magic word, preservation, which feels so important to continuously surface, because I think sometimes our public policy debate forgets that we're actually removing chairs from your proverbial musical chairs, and we have to sort of stop that before we're, just trying to play catch up. So I did want to invite, maybe just all three of you will take this as one last question, pre-democracy, to just say something about housing preservation. And, there's so many top line items that are in our public debate, whether it's just cause eviction laws, or there's an increasing conversation about the restoration of long leases, 6 month, 1 year, and so forth. And anyway, I would just invite each of you to talk about some kind of solution that you've seen work that helps sort of stop the production of new unhoused people.
Boy, I think the biggest challenge is identifying people at the right moment. We don't know the best way. We don't know exactly what the most frequent pathways into homelessness are. I think Margot can probably provide some survey data to inform us better than I can. But every year millions of people are evicted from their homes, but we don't have I don't think there's any kind of perfect algorithm that's going to tell us which of these people are going to be living on the streets 3, 6, 9 months down the road, and which are not. But to the extent to which we can intervene early in the lives of those who do have a homelessness spell as a result of things like eviction, that can pay so many dividends, because the longer you're on the streets, the more your problems compound, and nobody knows this better than the person to my left, so I'm just going to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said prevention is, so I think of prevention in terms of housing preservation, I think of eviction prevention, because what you're not only doing is preventing someone from going down that path to eventually become homeless. Sometimes people become homeless right away, sometimes through a variety of mechanisms, but you're also often preserving a unit of affordable housing that as soon as that person gets evicted, that unit in our tight housing markets flips and becomes much more expensive. Prevention, there is some exciting work now in LA. The California Policy Lab is basically using big data to identify, using signals like people applying for uninsurance, people having a domestic violence call, people having a death in the family, all things that can be often identified through public records, and focusing on impacted census tracks, because basically we haven't talked a lot about that if you are from a community of color, a community from a historically living in a historically disinvested, often formerly redlined neighborhood, you're at much, much, much higher risk of homelessness. And so they're basically using these signals to identify who's likely to become homeless, and are actually cold calling people. We actually know what to do to prevent the housing lost once we do. It's usually about $5,000 to $6,000, and some sort of good old-fashioned social work and some legal help can keep someone housed. I think the other big thing is that eviction prevention is really important. but more people become homeless after they've already lost that house and they're already doubled up, and those folks have no legal rights to that house. And what we have found is that those housing losses happen really quickly, which is why prevention is so hard. You need to find the right person and find them quickly.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about the preservation question, including thinking about using community-based models like community land trusts and cooperatives and other approaches to really preserving that affordability over the long term. But I think what I'm going to emphasize is there is a real power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Yeah. And some landlords are great and have their best interests of their tenants in mind. And we know that there are also landlords that are serial evictors and that are really using that property as a way to extract value. And we have no idea which is which because we have really shitty data on the rental market. And I say that word 100% with the feeling at the bottom of my heart. We do not know how much people are paying in rent for what quality of units. We don't know when somebody moves in or out of a rental unit. We don't know how much the landlord jacks up the price when somebody moves out. We have so little information about what is happening in the rental market, which in California houses about 56% of our families. And so I would say that we need to do daylight, take the idea that transparency is the key to democracy, and create a rental registry for the state so that we can actually understand what is happening in the rental market and then go after the bad actors.
Oh, Leif is standing there. That shows I've truly failed at my job to get to the democracy piece. So, but maybe I'll yield to you for Q&A.
I heard the word democracy just there. That was brilliant.
Success.
But we have so many more things to say about democracy.
I have a whole view of that.
You have your chance because we are now going to open up for democratic participation of the audience. Please, if you have thoughts, we do have a microphone here. If you have a question for any or all of our panelists, please feel free. Please ask a single question. If you could keep it concise, we'd be grateful.
So affordable housing for people exiting homelessness is often built concentrated in the same neighborhood, thinking the Tenderloin, Skid Row in LA, for example. This makes sense on the one hand, right? People with high needs need to access services. They're in these neighborhoods. It makes sense to be there. On the other hand, I worry that this leads to racial and economic segregation of people that are already high need, that are racialized in our society, and that are extremely low income. How do you think about that when we talk about our attempts to expand the supply of permanent supportive housing, of affordable housing in general, and the intersection of people exiting homelessness and societal segregation? Thank you.
Can I jump in there? I think that unfortunately in a lot of California communities, homelessness is spread and dispersed around enough of the metropolitan area, enough of like major cities. Certainly I could say that about Los Angeles, where like if you build supportive housing where clusters of people experiencing homelessness are, like you would actually disperse that housing. If you did truly build it where people are. I mean, you know, I work at UCLA, so I try not to live too far away from it because the traffic super sucks in LA. And so I live on the west side of LA where, you know, the homes are at their most expensive. And there's homelessness all over the west side of Los Angeles. It's in Santa Monica, it's in Venice, it's in, you know, Brentwood. It's in, you know, it's everywhere. So unfortunately, I don't think there's really always much of a trade-off between building supportive housing where the homelessness challenges are, like, or you know, and the thing that we worry about is like pulling people away from a community that they're rooted in, right? And, you know, you could do that in a lot of higher income areas in the state of California and still, be serving people where they are.
Please. Microphone.
Thank you for this forum. I apologize I came late. And when I arrived, I just heard your presentation where you said homelessness can be framed two ways: scarcity and criminalization. And my political antenna went up right away. My first thought, why use the word criminalization? I think Mayor Matt Mahan, candidate for governor, he would, having read quite a bit about his position and actually written about it for the urban planning website, Plan Edison, I think he would use the term accountability, not criminalization. Likewise, when you brought up the word chronic homelessness, that's a really critical issue. And another term that I would suggest that perhaps future forums you consider using is a term he uses, Mahan uses all the time. And by the way, I do not support Mahan for governor, just want to get that out. He uses the term unsheltered homelessness. And I strongly encourage you to use that. And for the audience who's maybe not too familiar with the term,
Could you head toward the questions, please?
yeah, I'll end with that. If you ask what the percentage of unsheltered homelessness is in California, and you compare it to New York, it's night and day.
Does anyone want to respond to?
Well, right. I mean, we have more unsheltered homelessness because New York has a right to shelter and we don't. It's nothing to do with the characteristics of the people. One of the things is that our descriptions of unsheltered homelessness come out of the Northeast, where they're mostly about 95% of people are sheltered. And if you have a right to shelter and you are unable to exercise that right, it signals that you probably have a very serious disabling condition, as many of those folks do. In California right now, about two-thirds of everyone, about three-quarters of adults who experience homelessness are primarily unsheltered. That's a public policy decision. As Caroline said, we clearly need more shelter, but shelter isn't the end, because, right, if you build shelter and people can't leave shelter, then the shelters just fill up, and then you need more shelter and more shelter and more shelter. And the average length of stay in New York is something like 10 years in shelter, because they can't get anyone out the other end because they've spent all their money on shelter. But the people who are most visible and most upsetting to the public, for understandable reasons, are the people with severe mental health and substance use problems. It is not okay, and it is very upsetting to see it. But in our encampments, outside are also lots of people who do not have those problems, and we need to be careful in our narratives. We have no shelter, and we have no housing. And I take care of many people who clean our office buildings and our hospitals at night and sleep outside during the day. Many people. And the public doesn't see them as homeless. They are invisible, and it becomes this tautology. If the only people you see as homeless is a person on Fox News, then the person who is cleaning, who is working 40 hours a week, is rendered completely invisible. If anyone has ever gone to take an Uber from SFO and you travel with your family of 4 and you try to put 4 roller bags and you have to go through 4 drivers before someone has room for your 4 roller bags, it's because they are living in their cars. And those folks are working 60, 70 hours a week, but they are rendered completely invisible, and they are also unsheltered. So I think what the public is understandably very distressed about are so many people with such visible signs of very severe mental health and substance disorders who are on our streets. But I also want to tell you is the reason we have so much homelessness in California is not that we have a higher percentage of people with those problems than we do in the rest of the country. We don't. We're sort of mid-range across the states. But the reason we have so many people is because also, if you are a black man who has worked as a janitor your whole life and then you throw out your back and your mother dies, you are out on the streets. And that is what we also need to be talking about.
Yeah. I want to address your point on criminalization. I use that word intentionally because when we fine people for being poor, when we put people in jail for being poor, we are criminalizing poverty. I do not think that is, my idea of accountability is giving everybody housing assistance who needs it. And I think if we were to actually invest in solutions, we could be accountable not only to the people who give money to political campaigns, but actually accountable to our neighbors, our citizens, our workers, our most vulnerable in society. So I do not think we should put people in jail or take people's belongings away or separate them from friends and family just because they don't have enough money to pay for rent.
Brian Coyne.
Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you. I found myself thinking about an argument that I associate with Jerusalem Demsas from The Atlantic, but I think others have made as well, that one of the roots of the political choices, the political problems that you identified as roots of this, was the earlier American policy choice to make home ownership the primary vehicle for growing wealth over time. And Demsas argues that this essentially created NIMBYism by giving two-thirds of American families this really big incentive for the price of housing in their communities to grow faster than inflation. So I'm wondering if you share that analysis, and either way, how do we break out of this impasse that you all identified in different ways, where there are fundamentally fewer chairs than there are people?
Yeah, I mean, I chose the short straw to talk about zoning up here, so I'll keep going. I mean, woe is me. I call that the short straw. So I think that's part of it. I think there's I think there's definitely evidence that people are not very interested in having more neighbors because they think that the construction of more housing units around them is going to impact their property values for various reasons. But I think there are other reasons too, and I don't know what adds up to the most, but I would venture to guess that that the totality, at least, of the other reasons probably adds up to more than the kind of financial considerations. And I would add, just general congestion worries, right? My schools are going to get overcrowded. Where are they going to park? Where are these new people going to park? That's what we hear in Los Angeles. I don't know if you're in a place that actually has transit and you don't worry about these things, but everybody cares about parking usually. There's infrastructure concerns that I think end up being wrought. I think we can figure out sewers and water if we build housing. But those things end up being real. I think a fear of change generally pervades most of our psyches that gets us, not really interested in cranes building things nearby us. So I think there's that. And then, the other one, race. Race and class, figure, I think, a lot into this. It's not, and that's, some of that might be intertwined with your concerns about your property values. You think if, your neighborhood diversifies, like maybe your property value will go down. That was like a real mechanism in the middle of the 20th century, that people that, kind of ran our entire real estate industry to some extent. But, I think, underlying, concerns about diversification of your neighborhood, I think, matter a lot in people's minds, whether they'll admit it or not.
Could I actually jump in here? Because I think one of the things that the United States has shifted towards is a property-owning democracy, right? We are an asset-based welfare state. So if you own your home, you have security in retirement, you can send your kids to college, all of the things that a welfare state should provide. And we organize our entire housing system around the logic of property rights and the right to make as much profit off of your property as you can. We see that in how we talk about it. We talk about buildings penciling. We don't talk about requiring developers to build a lot of housing for people. And so I think that type of asset-based welfare state or property-owning democracy can be actually a good place, but it must be supplemented by a strong welfare function to be able to serve the redistribution function of the state. Because without that, you are only going to have increasing income inequality and increasing wealth concentration, which is what we see. And so if we're going to hold on to this approach, then we also need to rebuild our welfare state.
With apologies, we have time for one more quick question, please, on this. All the way over. Yes.
Hi, thank you. As the state government takes more of a role in preempting local laws with things like SB 79, which you mentioned, and trying to override local zoning, there's been some backlash, excuse me, from groups who aren't just traditional NIMBYs, but also some genuine low-income tenant grassroots groups who are concerned that as a result of a lot of new development, there may be some development that leads to more gentrification or pushes some groups out. Without getting too much into like the policy and economic weeds of whether or not that's actually true, from like a democratic design standpoint, weaving into the theme, what exactly do you all think is sort of the role for local participation and democratic participation at all when it's coming from a good faith place of concerns of gentrification in terms of the broader housing ecosystem?
Yeah. You wanna?
I think it's one of the most pressing and difficult questions of our day,
Yeah.
right? How do we both facilitate housing production and ensure that top-down planning processes don't further disadvantage communities of color or neighborhoods that have been subject to many planning decisions that have hurt them over the decades? I think from my perspective, it is having great planning processes that actually lead to agreement around the zoning of the entire city, that every neighborhood does its fair share of housing production, and that you agree what kind of housing you want where at the planning stage so that you're not fighting over every property. And also ensuring that as part of those conversations, there are communities of color at the table, resourcing those communities to be part of the participation process, and really doing true participatory democracy as opposed to check the box.
I'm super glad I deferred to Caroline on that one because I knew she'd kill it. The only thing I would add is I don't think input and democracy are the same thing, right? So I think there's been too much input from some aspects of our city public, right? And this is, higher income neighborhoods, whatever you want to call them, NIMBYs, whatever. Like they've had too much input most of the time. And the neighborhoods, the communities that Carolina referenced, and the ones and the groups and the organizations that you reference have had not enough input, right? And so to me, democracy is like finding a way to level that playing field. And the government is another player in this. It's not just about equalizing input between your high income and your low income neighborhoods, just to keep it simple. There's also how is power shared between all of these groups and the representatives they elect in this executive branch that carries out all the stuff. I think it's but you have to start with equalizing that playing field somehow, reducing the input on one part of town, increasing the input on another part of town. That to me, I think really strengthens the democratic process when it comes to planning and housing and all of these complicated city things.
Can I just smuggle in a quick comment, because I teach in this field and it's really important to me, and it has become concerning to me the way that housing and our debate over local autonomy with respect to housing has blotted out local autonomy over all kinds of other issues. I always teach my students, I'm all for yanking back local control over resistance to multifamily housing. There's all kinds of reasons, you've heard them all today, in which that subject has to be treated differently. But there are huge parts of the country in which what is at stake in local control is control over guns, control over schools, and right now, especially control over water when it comes to the placing of big data centers. And so there's a lot of other things at stake, even just in the column of land use policy. So I would encourage folks here to feel liberated, to draw a distinction between local control in general and local control in this specific context. It's really important to parts of the country that are not the big booming metros.
Yeah. It's a good note to end on. I have the honor of closing us out. So everybody please join me in thanking all of our speakers tonight. Just a quick reminder to stay connected to the Center for Ethics. Please learn more about our upcoming events at the link you see. But most importantly, thank you all in attendance, but also you online as well. Have a good night. Get home safe.